Hello everyone, this is Pushpoint, and I am your storyteller. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. Like the video and subscribe the channel.
After where are you from and what time you are watching now, get comfortable and relax. Story 1. The Echo of Wraith Hollow.
The rain whispered through the skeletal branches of the ancient pines, each droplet a quiet drumbeat against the sodden earth.
Arthur Hollis tightened his coat, the wool heavy with the damp chill of the mountain air. His boots sank into the mud as he approached the mouth of Wraith Hollow, a place the locals of Blackridge had long abandoned to superstition and whispered fears. He had heard the stories in the tavern, murmurs of voices in the wind, shadows that lingered long after the firelight had died, and the inexplicable feeling of being watched by something ancient and restless.
But to Arthur, a man more comfortable with the hard facts of mining reports and geological surveys, ghost stories held little weight.
The company had sent him to assess the viability of reopening the abandoned Wraith Hollow mine, and he intended to do just that.
The entrance loomed before him, a jagged wound in the side of the mountain, its stone lips dark and gaping, draped in creeping moss, the rusty, twisted remnants of a gate hung on broken hinges, creaking softly as the wind teased it.
Arthur clicked on his lantern, the weak, yellow beam cutting through the oppressive darkness within.
The air in the tunnel clung to his skin, damp and cold, carrying with it a scent of wet stone and something faintly metallic, like old blood.
His breath plumed in the air as he stepped deeper, each footfall echoing into the unseen depths.
The rough-hewn walls, carved by forgotten hands, pressed close around him, their uneven surfaces glistening with moisture. He paused, listening to the slow drip of water from somewhere ahead.
As the light of the entrance faded behind him, the silence thickened, settling into his bones like a slow, creeping frost. He felt the weight of the mountain above the suffocating crush of earth and stone, 1,000 tons waiting to collapse, as if the mountain itself resented his intrusion. Then, faintly, from the darkness ahead, came a sound that did not belong.
A slow, scraping whisper, like the rustle of brittle leaves on a stone floor.
He held his breath, his lantern trembling slightly in his grasp.
The sound ceased, and the silence roared back, louder than before. Arthur forced a breath into his lungs, the sharp air cutting his throat. It was nothing. He told himself a rat, perhaps, or the settling of old timber braces. He pressed on, deeper into the twisting guts of the earth, where the air grew colder still.
The tunnel branched suddenly, the left path descending sharply into a deeper, unknown darkness.
He hesitated, the beam of his lantern catching on a faint smear of dark rust along the wall, trailing downward into the depths. He shivered, the chill suddenly more pronounced, as if the stone itself exhaled a cold, wet breath.
Something brushed his cheek. He flinched back, swinging the lantern wildly, its beam slicing through the dark. But there was nothing, only the glistening stone, slick and unyielding. His heart thudded painfully in his chest, the pulse echoing in his ears. Then he saw it. At the edge of his light, a shape moved pale and indistinct, like a wisp of fog drifting just beyond reach. It slipped soundlessly around a corner, the faint echo of bare feet on wet stone lingering in its wake.
Arthur stumbled back, his foot catching on a loose rock, the clatter of stone against stone reverberating through the tunnel like a gunshot.
He spun, the lantern's glow casting frantic, shifting shadows against the jagged walls. He turned back toward the entrance, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the sound of his own heartbeat a thunder in his ears.
As he fled, the whispers rose around him, a soft, mocking chorus, the voices of long-dead miners, their words a twisted lullaby that echoed through the twisting, blackened veins of the mountain.
When he finally burst into the cold, rain-soaked air outside, he stumbled to his knees, the breath torn from his lungs. The mouth of the hollow gaped behind him, its darkness alive with the faint, whispering echoes of those who had never left. And as he staggered back toward the distant lights of Blackridge, he swore he felt eyes upon him, cold, patient, and hungry, waiting for the day he would return. Story 2. The House on Ashen Lane.
The rain had been falling for days, transforming the narrow cobbled streets of Ashen Lane into dark, glistening veins.
Eleanor Hastings pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her boots splashing through shallow puddles as she approached the old house.
Its silhouette loomed ahead, a crooked, forgotten relic at the end of the lane, its sagging roof and shattered windows like the hollow eyes of a skull. Eleanor had never believed in ghosts.
A practical woman of 37, she had little patience for the superstitions that clung to the old quarter like damp fog. But the letter she received 3 days ago had pulled her back to this place, to the house she had sworn never to enter again.
The door creaked as she pushed it open, the wood swollen and splintered from decades of neglect. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of mildew and rot. The smoke swirled in the weak light that filtered through the broken windows, their dance slow and mournful.
As she stepped inside, the rain's muffled drumming became a distant, hollow murmur, the house swallowing sound like a dark ocean.
Her footsteps echoed through the empty hall, the floorboards groaning beneath her weight, as if the house itself whispered warnings to leave while she still could. The letter had been unsigned, its words scrawled in a hurried, jagged script.
It spoke of unfinished business, of restless spirits, of whispers that slipped through cracks in the walls. It had ended with a single, chilling rhyme. You left something behind. Eleanor's heart quickened as she moved deeper into the house.
She paused at the foot of the grand, spiraling staircase, its banister wrapped in cobwebs, the steps themselves sagging like the backs of weary old men. She remembered racing up those stairs as a child, her laughter ringing through the halls, her father's deep voice calling her to supper.
She shivered, the memory tinged with a sudden, inexplicable chill.
She moved down the hall, her fingers trailing along the peeling wallpaper, the once vibrant patterns now faded to the colour of old bone. As she passed the parlour, she caught a glimpse of the shattered mirror above the cold, cracked hearth. She paused, her breath catching. For a moment, she swore she saw a figure reflected there, a shadow, tall and slender, its head tilted as if listening. But when she turned, the room was empty, only the dust and shadows remaining.
She forced herself onward, her pulse a steady drumbeat in her ears. She reached the door at the end of the hall, the one that led to the cellar, the place she had never dared enter as a child, the place her father had always kept locked.
The door stood ajar. Eleanor hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for the rusted knob. The air that seeped from the darkness beyond was colder, thicker, carrying with it a faint, sickly sweet odour she could not place. She stepped inside, her heart pounding, her breaths coming short and shallow. The steps creaked beneath her, each one a low, mournful groan. Shadows pulled at the edges of her lantern's flickering light, twisting and coiling like living things. At the bottom, she found the source of the smell, an old trunk, its lid cracked open, the wood dark with moisture. She leaned closer, her lantern casting jagged, dancing shadows against the stone walls. She could see something within, a shape wrapped in tattered cloth, its outline disturbingly human. She reached down, her fingers brushing the coarse fabric, and felt the brittle resistance of bone beneath.
Her breath caught, the air suddenly thick and choking.
Then, from behind her, the door creaked shut.
The lantern's flame flickered, and for a brief, horrifying moment, she heard a whisper, a child's voice, soft and close, its tone mournful and accusing.
You left me behind. The darkness pressed in, cold and suffocating, as Eleanor's scream echoed through the forgotten halls, lost beneath the endless, whispering rain.
Story 3. The Watcher in the Mist. The rain had swallowed the coastal road, turning the narrow path into a slick ribbon of stone and mud that clung desperately to the edge of the sea cliff.
Catherine Parker gripped the wheel of her old station wagon, her knuckles pale in the dim light. The wipers struggled against the sheets of rain, each pass revealing only a fleeting glimpse of the road before the darkness closed in again.
The old lighthouse had stood for over a century, a lone sentinel against the raging sea, its beams slicing through fog and storm to guide lost ships to safety. But now it sat abandoned, its great iron lantern cold and dark, its windows shattered by years of salt and wind.
The locals avoided it. Their tales of ghosts and cursed sailors whispered in the dim corners of seaside pubs. Catherine had never been one for superstition. She was a marine biologist, a woman of science and reason. sent to survey the rocky coastline for a new tide energy project. The lighthouse, with its high vantage point and panoramic views, was a perfect base of operations. She pulled up beside the crumbling stone wall that marked the lighthouse grounds.
The engine sputtered as she cut the ignition. The sudden silence broken only by the rhythmic crash of waves against the rocks below and the hiss of rain against the rusted metal of the old gate. Catherine fumbled with her flashlight, the beam flickering before settling into a steady white cone.
She stepped into the storm, pulling her hood tight, her boots sinking into the waterlogged earth. The wind tore at her coat, its icy fingers slipping through every gap, the cold sharp and biting. The lighthouse door groaned as she forced it open, the rusted hinges protesting like the creak of an ancient ship. The air inside was heavy, thick with the scent of damp stone and seaweed, tinged with something sharper, like scorched metal.
Her footsteps echoed against the stone floor, the sound bouncing of the curved walls of the tower. She set up her gear in the old keeper's quarters, the small, square room still cluttered with the remnants of a life long forgotten, a rusted kettle, a cracked leather armchair, a thick layer of dust coating every surface. She pushed the window open, the glass rattling in its frame, and stared out at the dark, heaving sea below. As she turned to unpack her equipment, the beam of her flashlight caught a shape near the far wall, a figure, small and indistinct, a shadow clinging to the curve of the stone, like a drowned man grasping the side of a lifeboat.
She froze, the beam trembling in her grasp, her breath catching in her throat.
But when she turned back, the shadow was gone, swallowed by the darkness.
Hours passed as she worked,
the storm outside growing fiercer, the wind howling through the cracks in the stone, the old iron supports groaning like the hull of a ship in a storm. She had just finished her initial survey notes when she heard it, a slow, deliberate scrape against the iron staircase that wound its way up to the lantern room above. She paused, her pulse thundering in her ears, the flashlight's beam trembling as she turned it toward the stairs.
Nothing moved.
She forced herself to breathe, to remember the rational explanation for the settling of the tower. The wind, the ancient metal protesting the weight of the storm. But then it came again, louder this time, the unmistakable sound of slow, wet footsteps climbing the spiral stairs. Catherine's hand shook as she approached the base of the staircase, her flashlight beam slicing through the darkness.
The steps ahead were empty, the spiral vanishing into the shadows above. She took a breath, her chest tight, and began to climb. The air grew colder as she ascended, the wind outside howling through cracks in the stone, the sea roaring below. The steps grew narrower, the walls pressing closer, the darkness deeper.
When she reached the lantern room, she paused at the threshold, her flashlight flickering. The room was empty, the great iron lantern still and silent, the shattered glass scattered across the floor like the bones of forgotten sailors. Then, from behind her, a cold breath brushed her cheek, carrying with it the briny stench of the deep sea. She spun, the flashlight beam catching a glimpse of wet, glistening skin, pale as the belly of a drowned fish, the shape slipping silently back down the stairs, the echo of wet footsteps fading into the darkness below. The door slammed shut behind her, the old iron hinges shrieking, and the cold, salty wind whipped through the shattered windows, carrying with it the faint, distant echo of a ship's bell, tolling from somewhere far beneath the waves. Catherine's scream was lost to the storm as the lantern's beam flickered to life once more, casting long, twisted shadows against the fog-drenched sea. Story 4. The sighing woods. The rain had not stopped for a week, draping the dense forest in a cold, unending shroud.
Thick mist clung to the trunks of ancient trees, their twisted limbs reaching like bony fingers into the grey sky.
Daniel Weaver pulled his collar higher against the chill, his breath misting in the damp air as he pushed deeper into the woods.
He had come here alone, drawn by the promise of isolation and the quiet needed to finish his manuscript.
The cabin, an old hunting lodge forgotten by time, sat miles from the nearest town, its walls thick with the scent of pine and smoke.
It had been perfect, but first the crackle of the fire, the patter of rain on the roof, the creak of the old wood beneath his boots.
But as the days stretched into a week, the isolation had begun to weigh on him. pressing against his mind like a slowly tightening vice.
It was the whispers that had started to unnerve him.
At first, he had dismissed them as wind in the trees, the rustle of leaves stirred by the storm. But then he began to hear his name, faint and breathless, slipping through the cracks in the cabin walls as the fire died each night.
Daniel. He had searched the surrounding woods more than once, his flashlight slicing through the mist, his boots sinking into the soft, wet earth.
But he found nothing, only the twisted roots of ancient oaks, their gnarled fingers reaching for his ankles, the shadows clinging to their trunks like mourners.
Today, he had set out with his axe, the weight of the cold steel a small comfort in his grasp. The path twisted deeper into the woods, the undergrowth thick and grasping, the air growing colder as the trees closed in around him. The mist clung to his clothes, wet and heavy, the world around him muffled and close. As he crossed a narrow stream, his boots slipped on a moss-covered stone, the shock of icy water soaking through his socks.
He cursed, steadying himself against a nearby tree, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps.
It was then he saw it, a shape, pale and distant, slipping silently between the trees, its form barely more than a shadow in the mist.
He straightened, his heart thudding in his chest, the cold bite of fear creeping up his spine. He tightened his grip on the axe, his eyes straining to follow the figure as it vanished into the fog.
He moved cautiously, his boots squelching in the mud, the air around him thick and oppressive. The trees loomed closer, their branches overhead twisting into a dark canopy that blocked the weak grey light of the stormy sky.
Then he heard it again, the whisper, clearer this time, coming from somewhere just ahead.
Daniel. He froze, the hair on the back of his neck rising, his breath catching in his throat.
The voice was close to close, and it carried with it the damp, earthy scent of freshly turned soil. He swung his flashlight into the gloom, the beam catching on twisted roots and tangled branches, the mist swirling in the light like smoke.
And there, at the base of an ancient, gnarled oak, he saw it, a fresh grave, the earth dark and loose, the edges crumbling where the rain had washed away the soil. As he stepped closer, the whisper rose again, low and desperate, the voice stretching out into a long, sighing moan. Daniel, you promised. His blood turned to ice as he realized the voice was coming from the ground itself, the wet earth shuddering and shifting beneath his feet. He staggered back, his breath coming in sharp, ragged bursts, his pulse a deafening roar in his ears. The mist thickened around him, the pale shapes of twisted figures slipping between the trees, their hollow eyes watching from the shadows.
He turned and ran, his boots slipping on the wet stones, the whispers following him through the trees, rising to a mournful wail as the cabin came into view, its windows dark and watching, the door standing ajar. He stumbled inside, slamming the door behind him, the echo of his ragged breaths filling the empty room.
As the fire crackled to life, he sank into the old leather chair, his axe still clutched in his trembling hands, his mind reeling. The whispers had not followed him, the forest silent once more, the rain a gentle murmur against the root. But as he stared into the flickering flames, he saw them pale faces in the firelight, their hollow eyes fixed upon him, their mouths opening wide in a silent, endless scream. Story 5. The Mirror of Black Hollow Bay. The rain whispered against the cracked windows of the old coastal manor, its steady drumming a solemn dirge for a place long abandoned. Clara shifted her lantern as she crossed the threshold, her boots leaving damp prints on the dust-coated floorboards. The air was thick with the sour scent of sea salt and mould, the walls streaked with the leavings of long-dead barnacles and creeping rot. She had come to Black Hollow Bay searching for her brother, Henry, who had vanished nearly a year ago. His last letter had mentioned this place, a forgotten manor perched on the edge of the storm-battered cliffs, its foundations sinking slowly into the dark, wet earth. The locals had warned her against coming here, their eyes dark with whispered fears of things that moved in the fog and shadows that whispered in the night. The main hall stretched before her, its ceiling last to shadows, the weak glow of her lantern casting long, twisted shapes across the walls. Faded portraits lined the walls,
their eyes blackened with mold, their faces smudged and distorted by decades of damp. She paused before a particularly large painting, the canvas slashed and sagging. The image beneath warped and twisted like the face of a drowned sailor. The floor creaked beneath her as she moved deeper into the house, her breath misting in the cold, salt-laden air. She paused at the foot of a grand, spiraling staircase, the banister wrapped in cobwebs, the steps themselves splintered and sagging like the ribs of a long-dead beast.
The whispers started as she reached the landing, faint and distant, slipping through the cracked walls and hollow spaces like a draft through a broken window.
She hesitated, the lantern trembling in her grasp, her pulse a steady drumbeat in her ears.
She followed the whispers down a narrow hall, the walls close and suffocating, the air growing colder with each step. She passed doorways choked with shadows, the rooms beyond black and yawning, their contents lost to darkness and decay. At the end of the hall, she found it a room larger than the rest, its windows shattered, the rain slipping through cracks in the walls to form dark, glistening pools on the warped floorboards.
In the center of the room stood a mirror, its frame blackened with age, the glass streaked and clouded, its surface rippling like the surface of a deep, dark sea.
She stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat as her reflection swam into view, pale, wide-eyed, her face drawn and ghostly in the flickering light of the lantern. But as she leaned closer, she saw it a shape behind her, tall and thin, its face twisted into a black, hollow scream, its eyes empty pits that wept dark, glistening tears.
She spun, her lantern beam slicing through the darkness, but the room was empty, the shadows clinging to the walls like wet seaweed, their shapes shifting and whispering in the corners.
Her breath came in sharp, panicked gasps as she turned back to the mirror, her reflection rippling, the shadow still there, closer now, its bony fingers stretching toward her, its mouth opening wide, black and endless, the sound of rushing water filling her ears. She stumbled back, her lantern slipping from her grasp, the glass shattering against the floor, the flame guttering and dying in a pool of oil. In the darkness, the whispers grew louder, the air thickening around her, the wet, cold touch of unseen hands brushing against her skin. She turned, her breath a sharp, panicked whimper, her eyes wide and blind in the pitch black.
The door slammed shut behind her, the wood splintering as the lock clicked into place, and as the darkness closed in, she felt it, the cold, wet breath of the thing behind her, its shadow stretching across the floor, its hollow, waterlogged mouth opening wide as the whispers rose to a deafening roar.
Welcome home, Clara.
Story 6. The Forgotten Bells of Ashford Abbey.
The rain had swallowed the countryside, transforming the narrow lanes and rolling fields into a sea of grey, mist-shrouded shapes. Samuel Gray wrapped his cloak tighter as he trudged up the muddy path toward the crumbling silhouette of Ashford Abbey, its twisted spires rising like skeletal fingers from the hilltop. The abbey had stood for nearly 5 centuries, its stones weathered by countless storms, its walls cracked and blackened by the fires of forgotten wars. The village below had long since been abandoned, its thatched roofs collapsed, its wells choked with weeds and broken stone. Only the abbey remained, its bell tower silent for 100 years, its bells lost to the passage of time. Samuel had heard the stories, whispered tales of ghostly monks that wandered the mist, their hollow eyes glowing in the darkness, their rotting fingers reaching for the living. But he was a scholar, a man of letters and reason, and he had come here not for ghost stories, but to find the lost manuscripts rumoured to be hidden within the abbey's forgotten crypts. The great iron-bound door groaned as he forced it open, the sound echoing through the empty halls like the groan of an ancient ship. The air within was cold, thick with the scent of damp stone and mould. The shadows long and twisted, their edges sharp and threatening. His boots scraped against the cracked flagstones as he moved deeper into the abbey, his lantern casting flickering, nervous shadows against the pitted walls. The old wooden pews stood in neat rows, their surfaces carved with the names of forgotten monks, the edges once smooth by countless unseen hands. The whispering began as he reached the altar,
a faint, breathless murmur that seemed to rise from the cracks in the stone itself.
He paused, his heart quickening, his breath catching in the chill air. He turned slowly, his lantern's light trembling as it swept across the empty nave. The shadows seemed closer now, their shapes twisted and shifting, the cold air pressing in around him like the deep, icy waters of a forgotten sea.
Then he heard it, the distant, hollow toll of a bell, its deep, resonant note shivering through the stone walls, the sound echoing through the empty halls like the heartbeat of the long-dead abbey.
He froze, the lantern's flame flickering wildly, the shadows around him stretching and coiling like the limbs of ancient, unseen things. The bell tolled again, the sound closer now, louder, the vibrations rattling the loose stones above. Dust and fragments of crumbling mortar raining down from the ceiling. He turned, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps, his pulse a deafening roar in his ears. The shadows moved, they slipped from the corners, their dark forms stretching and swelling, their faces hidden beneath cowls of black, their hands clasped in silent prayer, their hollow eyes fixed upon him. He stumbled back, his lantern swinging wildly, the light casting twisted, jagged shapes against the walls. He turned, his boots scraping against the cold, wet stone, his breath coming in ragged, panicked bursts as he fled down the narrow hall, the whispers rising to a fevered, breathless chant behind him. As he reached the great door, the bell tolled again, the sound so loud it rattled his bones, the vibrations echoing through the stone walls like the roar of a storm past sea. He threw himself against the door, the rusted hinges shrieking as it creaked open, the cold, wet air rushing in around him like the breath of the dead. As he staggered down the muddy path, his heart thundering in his chest, the whispers followed him, their hollow voices rising into a single, shuddering note as the bell tolled one final, deafening time. And as the fog closed in around him, he swore he saw the dark shapes of robed figures watching from the shadows of the abbey, their hollow eyes following his every step. Story 7. The Keeper of the Eel Marsh. The rain fell in a steady, cold drizzle, turning the marshland into a quagmire of dark, glistening mud and slick, tangled reeds. Henry Marsh waded through the brackish water, his boots sinking into the sucky mud, each step a slow, laborious struggle. His lantern swayed from his outstretched arm, its weak, flickering light barely piercing the thick, swirling mist that clung to the ground like the breath of drowned sailors. The old house rose from the center of the marsh like a half-drowned corpse, its roof sagging, its walls streaked with dark, oily stains, its windows shattered and empty. The townsfolk called it the Eel House, a forgotten place left to the creeping tide and the endless, whispering rain. Henry had been drawn to it by a series of old journals he'd discovered in the library, their pages filled with accounts of strange lights in the marsh, of whispers in the fog, of shadows that moved beneath the black water. As he reached the crumbling stone steps that led up to the sagging front porch, he paused, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling, his breath misting in the cold, salt-laden air. He turned slowly, his lantern casting long, twisted shadows across the marsh, the reeds bending and swaying like the rotted fingers of the drowned. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the hinges rusted, the wood swollen and splintered from years of exposure to the salt-laden air. The interior was dark, the air thick and wet, the walls streaked with mold and the faint, sharp scent of rotting fish. His footsteps echoed against the warped, creaking floorboards as he moved deeper into the house, the light from his lantern flickering against the damp, crumbling walls. He paused in the front hall, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps, the cold air stinging his throat. Then he heard it, a slow, deliberate slithering, the sound of something wet and heavy dragging itself across the floor above him. He froze, his pulse thundering in his ears, his eyes wide and straining against the darkness. The sound paused, then resumed, the floorboards of a creaking and groaning beneath the weight of something vast and wet, its passage leaving a dark, glistening trail in its wake. He tightened his grip on the lantern, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps as he moved toward the staircase, his boots sinking into the damp, rotted boards, the air around him growing colder, the shadows deeper.
As he reached the base of the stairs, the slithering stopped, the air falling silent. The only sound a slow, steady drip of water from the cracked, sagging ceiling. He took a step up, the old wood creaking beneath his weight. The darkness above thick and pressing, the air wet and cold, like the breath of a drowned man. As he reached the top of the stairs, he paused, his lantern flickering, his breath catching in his throat.
The hallway stretched before him, its walls streaked with dark, oily stains, the air thick with the stench of wet, rotting flesh.
He stepped forward, his boots squelching against the damp, spongy boards, his heart thundering in his chest. Then, from the darkness ahead, he heard it a low, wet whisper, the voice thick and gurgling, the sound of water slipping through the cave, half-rotted vocal cords. "You came back."
He stumbled back, his lantern swinging wildly, the light casting twisted, frantic shadows against the walls. He turned, his boots slipping on the wet boards, his breath coming in ragged, panicked bursts as he fled back down the stairs, the shadows around him closing in, the whispers rising into a chorus of breathless, drowning voices.
As he reached the front door, he felt it, the cold, wet touch of a hand on his shoulder, its fingers slick and slimy, its grip tightening as he screamed, the lantern slipping from his grasp, the glass shattering against the floor,
the flame guttering and dying in a pool of oil.
And as the darkness closed in around him, the whispers grew louder, the air thick with the stench of rotting, salt-soaked flesh, the shadows stretching and twisting as the wet, cold brick pulled him slowly, inexorably back into the black,
whispering depths of the marsh.
Story 8. The House on Winter Hill.
The rain fell in heavy, freezing sheets, turning the winding mountain road into a slick, treacherous path.
Anna Thompson clutched the steering wheel of her old sedan, her breath fogging the cracked windshield as the tires struggled for traction on the ice-slicked asphalt.
The headlights barely pierced the dense fog that clung to the forest, the twisted trunks of ancient pines slipping in and out of view like the limbs of drowned giants. She had been driving for hours, the storm chasing her up the mountain like the slow, steady breath of some vast, unseen thing. The road signs had grown scarce, the turnouts fewer and farther between, until at last she found herself alone in the darkness. The only sound the rattle of her old engine and the slow, steady drumming of rain against the roof. As the road wound higher into the mountains, she saw it a dark, looming shape on the hilltop, its crooked, gabled roof rising against the night sky like the jagged fin of a breaching whale. The house was old, its windows dark, its walls streaked with rain and creeping moss, its gates rusted and hanging at angles, like the shattered roofs of some forgotten, long-dead beast. She pulled into the gravel drive, the tires crunching over wet stones, the engine sputtering as she cut the ignition.
The silence that followed was thick, oppressive, the darkness pressing in around her like the cold, wet fingers of the storm.
The door creaked as she stepped out, her boots sinking into the mud, the wind tearing at her coat, the air sharp and biting. She hesitated at the base of the stone steps, her breath misting in the freezing air, her heart thudding in her chest. She stared up at the dark, empty windows above, their cracked panes staring back at her like the empty, hollow eyes of the dead. The front door groaned as she pushed it open, the hinges rusted, the wood swollen and splintered from years of exposure to the damp mountain air. The darkness inside was thick, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and wet stone, the floorboards creaking beneath her boots. As she stepped into the entry hall, she fumbled for the flashlight in her pocket, the beam flickering weakly to life, casting long, twisted shadows against the warped walls and sagging ceiling. Dust hung in the air, each particle glinting in the weak, shifting light, the silence deep and endless, broken only by the slow, steady drip of water from the ceiling above.
As she moved deeper into the house, the shadows seemed to thicken, the air growing colder, the darkness pressing in around her like the rising tide. She paused at the foot of a grand, winding staircase, the banister wrapped in cobwebs, the steps themselves worn and sagging like the ribs of a long-dead beast. Then she heard it, a slow, deliberate creaking, the sound of something heavy moving on the floor above. The old boards groaning beneath its weight. Her pulse quickened, her breath catching in her throat as she turned slowly, the flashlight beam trembling in her grasp as it swept across the empty hallway.
Nothing moved, but the sound continued, slow and steady, a deliberate, shuffling tread that seemed to grow louder with each passing moment, the old wood creaking and popping like the hull of a ship in a storm. She took a step back, her boots slipping on the wet, warped boards, the darkness around her thickening, the air growing colder, the shadows stretching and shifting in the corners of her vision. Then, from the darkness above, she heard it a long, low sigh, the sound slipping through the cracks in the floorboards like the breath of a dying man. She turned, her heart thundering in her chest, her pulse a deafening roar in her ears as she fled back down the hallway, her flashlight swinging wildly, the beam casting twisted, frantic shadows against the walls.
As she reached the front door, the slow, steady footsteps paused, the air falling silent, the darkness thick and pressing, the cold sharp and biting against her skin. She hesitated, her hand on the rusted doorknob, her breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. Then, from the darkness behind her, she heard it, a voice, low and breathless, the words slipping through the shadows like a whisper from the grave. "Welcome home, Anna." The door slammed shut behind her. The echo of her scream lost to the darkness as the rain battered against the roof above, the shadows stretching and twisting, their hollow eyes watching as she sank to her knees, her flashlight guttering and dying in a pool of cold, wet darkness. Story 9. The rain came down in a cold, relentless sheet, lashing the rocky shore with a fury that seemed to shake the very bones of the ancient lighthouse. Thomas Reed stood at the edge of the cliff, the wind tearing at his soaked coat, his eyes fixed on the churning Gracie below, the beacon behind him, a towering sentinel of weathered stone and rusted iron, pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm, its light cutting through the storm like a blade.
He had been the keeper of this lonely place for 6 months now, ever since the previous keeper had vanished without a trace during a night much like this one.
The isolation pressed down on him like the weight of the endless waves. The howl of the wind, a constant reminder of the vastness of the world and the smallness of man within it. Inside the lighthouse, the air was thick with the scent of salt and oil, the walls lined with peeling paint and ancient, rusted machinery. Thomas moved carefully along the narrow spiral staircase, his footsteps echoing hollowly as he ascended to the lantern room. The wind's howl was muffled here, replaced by the low hum of the lamp's engine and the steady ticking of the old clockwork that rotated the great Fresnel lens.
As the storm raged outside, Thomas's thoughts drifted back to the journals he had found in the keeper's quarter's cryptic notes about strange lights seen at sea, mysterious vessels that vanished beneath the waves, and voices carried by the wind that no man should hear. The entries grew darker, the handwriting more erratic as the months passed. Suddenly, a sharp tapping sound broke through the mechanical drone, soft, deliberate, coming from the small window that overlooked the cliffside path.
Thomas's heart quickened as he turned toward the noise, the beam of his lantern slicing through the gloom.
Outside, the rain blurred the world into an endless grey, but in the faintest moment of clearing, he glimpsed a figure standing at the edge of the cliff, tall, still, shrouded in dripping seaweed and dark clothing that seemed to absorb the light. He blinked and the figure was gone, his breath caught in his throat as the tapping resumed, now louder and more insistent, tracing patterns against the gloss like the slow, deliberate scratching of long, brittle fingernails. Thomas approached the window, wiping the wetness from the pane with a trembling hand. Beyond the glass, the cliff's edge was empty save for the jagged rocks and the ceaseless, hungry sea below.
A cold dread settled over him, deeper than the storm outside, a weight that pressed on his chest and clawed at his mind. He turned away from the window, but the tapping followed, echoing through the narrow room like a heartbeat.
That night, sleep eluded him as the storm's fury raged on. Shadows danced in the flickering lamplight, shapes twisting into faces with hollow eyes and open mouths.
Thomas felt eyes upon him, unseen and unblinking. Hours passed, or was it days? Time lost meaning within the lighthouse's stone walls.
The whispers began then, low and sibilant, carried on the wind that seeped through the cracked mortar voices speaking in tongues long dead, promising secrets buried beneath the sea, the price of knowledge paid in blood and madness.
Thomas tried to resist, but the weight of the isolation and the endless storm gnawed at his mind.
One evening, as the lamp's glow wavered, he found himself drawn to the window once more.
Outside, the figure returned, its hollow eyes gleaming with cold fire, beckoning silently with a skeletal hand.
He reached out.
The glass shattered inward, the cold rush of sea spray and salt air flooding the lantern room. Thomas was pulled into the storm's embrace, swallowed whole by the hungry night and the whispering waves.
The next morning, the supply boat arrived to find the lighthouse dark and silent, the great beacon extinguished. Inside, the spiral staircase was stained with salt water and seaweed, and the journals lay open on the floor, their pages soaked and smeared with ink that bled like blood.
And far below, the sea whispered on, carrying with it the endless echoes of the keeper's final vigil. Story 10. The Silent Room.
The rain began as a slow drizzle, then intensified into a relentless downpour, drumming against the stained glass windows of the old manor like 1,000 fingers tapping out a somber rhythm.
Evelyn Grant stepped through the grand doorway, the heavy scent of mildew and aged wood pressing into her lungs. She had come to the estate to catalogue its vast library and artifacts before the house was sold, an old family relic long abandoned, swallowed by years of neglect. The manor stood isolated atop the cliff, overlooking a restless sea. Its once grand facade was marked by cracked stone and creeping ivy that clawed at the walls like skeletal hands.
The local townsfolk spoke in hushed tones about the house's dark history, stories of vanished heirs, whispered madness, and a locked room that no one dared enter. Evelyn was a practical woman, steeped in logic and reason. Those stories were distractions. The real mystery lay in the countless volumes of forgotten knowledge waiting to be unearthed. But as she moved deeper into the manor's shadowed corridors, the atmosphere thickened, each step echoing like a heartbeat, each gust of wind through cracked panes a ghostly sigh.
She found the locked door on the second floor, framed by faded tapestries that swayed gently despite the still air.
The heavy oak was sealed with an iron latch, rusted but unyielding. No key hung nearby, no sign marked its purpose. Yet a strange pressure seemed to radiate from behind it like the breath of something waiting. Over the following days, Evelyn found herself drawn to the door, compelled by a force she could not name.
At night, the manor settled into a creaking silence broken only by distant thunder and the relentless rain.
But beneath that silence lay something else, an absence so profound it felt like a presence, an invisible weight pressing against her mind. One evening, as the storm raged fiercer than ever, Evelyn awoke to a faint whispering, indistinct but persistent, like a conversation just beyond understanding. The sound seemed to seep through the door, twisting her thoughts, seeding doubt and fear.
She approached, her hand trembling as she reached for the latch. The moment the door creaked open, a sudden cold washed over her, a void of silence so complete it swallowed sound itself.
Beyond the threshold was a small room, stripped bare walls painted in peeling black, a single wooden chair in the center, and no windows. The air was impossibly still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and forgotten memories.
As she stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her with a finality that echoed like a death knell.
Evelyn's breath came in shallow gasps. The silence pressed in on her, thick and suffocating.
Her flashlight flickered, then died, plunging her into darkness so complete it felt alive. From the shadows, a subtle shifting began, a presence coalescing, unseen but deeply felt.
Whispers bloomed into half-words, half-memories, voices of those trapped long ago, caught in the room's timeless grasp. Evelyn's mind twisted, visions bleeding into reality, faces pressed against invisible walls, reaching, pleading, footsteps pacing in endless circles. Panic surged, but the door would not budge.
Time lost meaning as the silence consumed her, a living thing that devoured hope and blurred the lines between sanity and madness.
Outside, the storm began to ebb, the rain slowing to a soft, haunting drizzle. The manor fell into its usual quiet, the locked room hiding its secrets once more, waiting for the next visitor, drawn by whispers in the dark.
Story 11. The Hollow Road. The rain was a steady murmur, a soft percussion against the worn asphalt of Hollow Road.
Jacob Evans drove slowly, his headlights cutting through the dense fog that wrapped the landscape like a cold, suffocating blanket. The narrow road twisted and turned, flanked on either side by towering, skeletal trees whose bare branches scraped the sky like desperate claws. He had taken this route only because the GPS insisted it was faster, an old shortcut through the woods, a path locals avoided.
Something about the way the road swallowed sound unsettled him. The usual hum of tires on pavement was muffled here, as if the very earth absorbed noise and life alike.
His radio crackled with static, the voices of distant, forgotten broadcasts seeping through like whispers from another time. As he drove deeper into the fog, the air grew colder, the rain heavier, and the world beyond his windshield faded into an abyssal grave. At a bend, the headlights caught the outline of a figure standing at the roadside, a woman, drenched, her dark hair plastered to her pale face, eyes wide and unblinking. Jacob slammed on the brakes, the car skidding on the slick surface to a halt just feet away.
She said nothing, only lifted a trembling finger and pointed further down the road, where the fog thickened, swallowing the path in its milky embrace. "Are you all right?" he called, stepping out into the rain, his boots sinking into the mud. But she only stared, unblinking, a silent sentinel trapped between worlds. He turned back to his car, heart pounding, when suddenly the road behind him rippled like the surface of a disturbed pond.
The trees bent and swayed unnaturally, their branches creaking in a voice that was almost human, whispering in tongues he could almost understand. The woman stepped forward then, her figure flickering, wavering as if caught between existence and oblivion. Jacob blinked, and she was gone. A sudden chill seized him as he hurried back into the car, the door slamming shut against the growing wind.
The engine sputtered, then died, leaving him stranded in the thick, suffocating fog.
He reached for his phone, no signal.
Minutes stretched into hours as the fog pressed closer, the rain's rhythm slowing, becoming irregular, as if breathing.
Jacob's headlights dimmed, flickered, and then went out, plunging him into an all-consuming darkness. In the silence, a low humming began, soft at first, like the murmur of distant voices, then rising into a chorus of desperate cries. Shapes moved just beyond the edge of his vision, shadowy figures with hollow faces and eyes that gleamed with cold fire. Jacob tried to start the car again, but the engine only groaned in protest.
The humming grew louder, the voices clearer, calling his name in tragic echoes, pulling at his mind like cold hands. The rain ceased suddenly, replaced by a heavy silence broken only by the creaking of the trees and the slow, deliberate footsteps circling the vehicle. His breath caught as the window beside him poked over from the inside, a pale handprint appearing on the glass log, slender fingers pressing just beyond reach.
The last thing Jacob saw before the fog swallowed the car whole was the woman's face, eyes empty and dark, a whisper on the wind that promised there was no escape from the hollow road.
Story 12. The Forgotten Asylum. The rain was relentless, a ceaseless drum that blurred the crumbling silhouette of the asylum against the darkening sky. Marat Winters stood before the iron gates, their rusted bars twisted like the bones of forgotten patience, the world around her swallowed by thick mist that curled and clung like ghostly fingers. She had come seeking the truth behind the asylum's closure decades ago, a place whispered about in town with hushed dread, where screams were said to echo long after the doors were sealed. The locals said it was cursed, haunted by the souls who'd suffered within its walls, their pain lingering like a stain on the very stones. The heavy gates groaned as she pushed them open, stepping into the overgrown courtyard where weeds tangled with shattered glass and rusted bed springs. The air was thick with decay, the scent of mold and forgotten sorrow rising in waves. Inside, the asylum was a labyrinth of peeling paint, cracked tiles, and darkened corridors where shadows pooled like ink. Marat's flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing torn patient records, broken wheelchairs, and scribbled messages etched into the walls, frantic words that begged for release. The deeper she ventured, the heavier the silence became, pressing on her chest. choking the air from her lungs. Then came the faint sounds, the soft shuffle of footsteps, distant whispers barely audible above the hum of her breath. She froze as a door at the end of the hall creaked open slowly, revealing a room shrouded in darkness. A single chair sat in the center, its leather cracked and stained as if waiting. Mira's skin prickled as unseen eyes seemed to watch her from every corner. A sudden chill swept the room, and the whispers rose into murmurs, voices calling names, pleading for help, promising horrors beyond imagining. Mira stumbled back, her flashlight flickering violently as the shadows converged, coalescing into twisted shapes patients from Lost. Their faces distorted by pain and madness, reaching with hands that passed through her like cold mist. She turned and fled, the asylum's corridors twisting impossibly as the walls seemed to breathe and close in, trapping her in a nightmare that stretched time and space. Outside, the rain washed away her footprints, the asylum swallowing its secrets once more, waiting silently for the next soul brave or foolish enough to enter. Story 13. The Watcher in the Woods. The rain fell softly, a steady patter on the canopy of ancient trees, muffling the sounds of the forest and turning the earth beneath Evelyn's boots into a slick carpet of mud and fallen leaves. She had set out early that morning, alone, drawn to the wilderness by a mixture of curiosity and a lingering ache of recent loss. The forest, locals said, was a place where time folded in on itself, where the boundary between the living and the forgotten thinned like morning mist. Evelyn moved deeper beneath the twisted branches, the fading light casting long shadows that seemed to shift with a mind of their own. The air was thick with damp and decay, the scent of moss and rotting wood sharp in her nostrils. Somewhere far off, a branch snapped, a deer perhaps, or something else watching silently from the shadows. As the hours slipped by, a quiet unease crept over her, a feeling of being observed, followed by eyes that never blinked. She paused, scanning the gloom between the trees, but saw nothing beyond the endless green and brown. Then she noticed subtle signs, a broken twig where no animal had passed, faint footprints too large and irregular to be human, the unmistakable feeling that the forest was breathing around her. She tried to turn back, but the path was gone, swallowed by undergrowth and mist. The rain thickened, muffling her calls for help, her footsteps swallowed by the earth. A sudden movement caught her eye, a figure standing just beyond the tree line, tall and still, face obscured by shadows. Evelyn's heart hammered as she raised her voice, but the figure didn't move, only watched. Hours turned to a haunting night as the rain persisted, the darkness deepening into a living presence. The Watcher remained at the edge of her vision, never closer, never leaving. When dawn finally broke, Evelyn stumbled from the forest's grasp, drenched and shivering, her mind frayed by the silent vigil of something that had waited patient and eternal in the woods. And somewhere behind her, the Watcher vanished, waiting for the next wanderer lost to the trees.
Story 14. The Echoes of Marrow House. The rain was a dull, steady drum against the shattered windows of Marrow House, each drop a tiny hammer strike on the brittle bones of the old mansion.
Claire Bennet hesitated at the threshold, the warped wooden floorboards creaking beneath her boots as she stepped inside. The air was heavy with dust and something else, an unnameable weight that pressed down like the suffocating silence before a storm.
She had inherited the house from a distant relative she'd never met, and though her city life urged her to sell it quickly, an inexplicable pull kept her rooted in the darkened halls.
The villagers had warned her. Marrow House was a place where memories lingered like shadows, where the past whispered in every corner. With only a flickering candle to light her way, Claire wandered through the rooms, each filled with relics of forgotten lives, faded portraits whose eyes seemed to follow her, cracked mirrors reflecting glimpses of things that shouldn't be. From the depths of the house came a faint sound, an echo that seemed to ripple through the walls, a child's laughter, soft and hollow, fading into silence. She followed it to the attic, a cramped space cluttered with broken toys and dusty trunks. The candle trembled in her hand as a cold draught swept through, carrying with it a faint murmur of voices, fragments of conversations, cries and lullabies woven together like a broken melody. Suddenly, the candle flickered out, plunging her into darkness.
The air grew thick, charged with a presence unseen but palpably close.
Claire's breath quickened as she felt the weight of countless eyes, ghostly witnesses trapped in a moment long past, watching, waiting.
A whispered name brushed her ear, a breath of cold that traced the nape of her neck. She stumbled backward, heart pounding, and fled down the attic stairs as the echoes followed, laughing, crying, calling her back into the shadows of Narrow House.
Outside, the rain washed the mansion's walls clean, but inside, the echoes remained, haunting the bones of the house and the fragile threads of memory that refused to die.
Story 15. The Lantern's Last Glow.
The rain fell in slow, heavy drops, each one tracing a cold path down the cracked panes of the tiny cabin perched on the edge of Blackwater Marsh.
Daniel Harper lit the oil lantern, its warm glow a fragile beacon against the creeping darkness that pressed in from every side.
The marsh was a place of whispered legends of lost souls swallowed by the bog, of lights seen dancing just beyond sight, and of a silence so thick, seemed to muffle not only sound but time itself.
Daniel had come here seeking solitude, a reprieve from the city's chaos.
But as night settled over the marsh, the isolation felt less like peace and more like a slow, tightening noose.
The rain tapped against the wooden walls, a rhythm that synced with the beating of his own heart, growing louder, more insistent.
Outside, the fog rolled in, a living thing weaving through the reeds and dead trees.
Shapes seemed to flicker at the edge of the lanterns like brief, shadowy glimmers that vanished when looked at directly.
The air grew colder, the damp seeping into his bones. A sudden scrape at the door made Daniel freeze.
He told himself it was the wind or an animal, but the sound came again deliberate, slow, like fingernails tracing wood.
With trembling hands, he blew out the lantern, plunging the cabin into darkness thick enough to choke on. In the blackness, whispers brushed past his ears, voices curling like smoke, speaking in a language just beyond understanding. The shadows deepened, closing in, and the pale light flickered outside dancing lanterns bobbing among the reeds, moving closer with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Daniel's breath hitched as the door creaked open by itself.
He reached for the lantern, but it lay shattered on the floor, its glow extinguished forever.
The last thing he saw was the marsh's endless dark swallowing him whole, the chorus of lost voices rising in a terrible, mournful harmony. When dawn finally broke, the cabin stood empty, its lantern dark, and the marsh returned to its restless silence, waiting for the next soul drawn to its depths. Story 16. The Watchtower Shadow. Rain hammered against the rusted metal of the old watchtower, each droplet a cold drumbeat in the oppressive night. Marcus Gray climbed the narrow spiral stairs with deliberate caution, the wood creaking beneath his boots like the groans of a long-forgotten beast. The tower, abandoned for decades, stood alone on a bleak hill overlooking the vast moorlands, a sentinel from a forgotten war, now nothing more than a skeleton of memories and rust. He had come here searching for answers, an old family mystery tied to the tower's shadowy past. Local legend spoke of a lookout who vanished one stormy night, his final watch ending in madness and silence. Marcus wasn't a believer in ghosts, but as the wind howled through shattered windows and the rain seeped through cracks in the walls, his certainty began to falter. At the top, the lantern room was a cage of broken glass and twisted metal, the lens long shuttered. Marcus lit a candle, its flickering flame casting toward dancing shadows that seemed to writhe on the peeling walls.
Outside, the moor stretched into an endless blackness, where nothing stirred but the restless rain and the sighing wind. Hours passed in eerie silence, broken only by the slow drip of water and the faint whisper of something moving just beyond sight.
The candle's light flickered violently as a chill swept through the room, a breath not carried by wind, but by something colder, darker.
Then came the sound, a soft tapping, like fingers drumming on wood, slow and rhythmic, echoing through the empty tower.
Marcus's heartbeat quickened as the tapping grew louder, closer, circling him. Shadows twisted, faces barely formed in the dark hollow eyes staring from the corners, waiting.
He turned to flee, but the staircase below was swallowed by darkness. The rungs rotted and broken, trapped. Marcus felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing in, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and forgotten sorrow.
The last candle guttered and died, and the tapping stopped, replaced by a silence so profound it screamed in his ears.
When morning came, the tower was empty, save for a single shoe resting on the wet floor, and the faint echo of a watchman's final, unanswered call. Story 17. The reflection in the well.
The rain fell in heavy sheets, turning the narrow lane into a slick ribbon of mud and shadows. Clara stepped carefully over puddles, her lantern casting trembling light onto the overgrown garden of the abandoned cottage she had inherited from her grandmother. The villagers avoided the place, whispering about the old well in the backyard, how it held secrets better left untouched. The well was a crumbling stone ring, half swallowed by ivy and moss, its depths lost in black water that reflected the storm-darkened sky. Clara approached, the air growing colder as she peered into the darkness below.
Her own reflection stared back at her, distorted, flickering, as if struggling beneath the surface.
A sudden drop of water splashed against the stone, echoing in the stillness like a soft heartbeat. She knelt, gripping the lantern tighter, when the surface rippled and a pale hand reached outward, slow, deliberate, desperate. Clara recoiled, but the hand grasped at the edge, followed by a shadowy figure that emerged from the depths. Its eyes were hollow, endless voids that swallowed the faint lantern glow.
A voice, barely a whisper, brushed her, calling her name, promising freedom and doom entwined.
The rain intensified, the well's dark waters swirling with unseen currents, pulling at her feet, beckoning her closer. She stumbled back, heart pounding, as the reflection shifted no longer her own, but the faces of those lost to the well's hungry depths, trapped in a mirror of endless night. The lantern flickered and died, leaving Clara in darkness filled with watery whispers and cold, reaching hands. Outside, the storm raged on, washing away footprints and voices alike, leaving only the well, waiting patiently for its next reflection to join the endless, silent depths.
Story 18. The last passenger. The rain pounded against the fog windows of the old bus. As it crawled down the winding country road, Thomas Hale sat alone in the back, clutching his worn briefcase, watching the world outside blur into a shifting canvas of grey and black.
The bus was nearly empty, the occasional passenger disappearing at stops that seemed to lead nowhere. The driver was silent, eyes fixed straight ahead, fingers tapping lightly on the steering wheel in time with the rain. Thomas noticed how the route twisted and turned into increasingly desolate stretches, where the trees leaned in like whispering sentinels and the streetlights flickered uncertainly, casting long, wavering shadows. The other passengers were strange, their faces pale and gaunt, eyes dull, their movements slow and unnatural. Occasionally, a passenger would glance at Thomas with a hollow smile, their lips barely moving as if words were trapped behind invisible walls.
At one stop, a woman stepped aboard, her coat soaked through, water dripping from the brim of her hat.
She sat next to Thomas without a word, her breath cold against his neck. He shivered, feeling an unnatural chill spread through the bus.
As the bus rumbled deeper into the night, the rain grew heavier, the windows fogging until the outside world vanished.
The soft hum of the engine was joined by whispers, barely audible voices murmuring from the shadows between seats.
Thomas tried to speak, to ask where they were headed, but the words caught in his throat.
The woman beside him smiled, and her eyes gleamed with an otherworldly light. Suddenly, the bus jolted and came to a stop on an empty stretch of road swallowed by mist. The driver turned slowly, revealing a face pale and cracked like ancient porcelain, eyes hollow and endless. "You're the last passenger," he whispered, voice echoing as the rain ceased, replaced by a suffocating silence.
The doors creaked open to reveal a void of darkness, infinite and waiting. Thomas stood, paralyzed as the passengers dissolved into shadows, their whispers fading into the night. With a final breath, he stepped forward. The bus was closing behind him, leaving only the empty vehicle to wait silently for the next journey into oblivion. Story 19. The Forgotten Choir. The rain was a slow, mournful hymn against the stained glass windows of the derelict church. its hollow echoes reverberating through the vast empty nave and across the threshold with hesitant steps, her flashlight beam cutting through the thick darkness like a lone prayer.
The village had long abandoned this place, its once proud congregation reduced to whispers and dust. But Anna was drawn here by an old diary she had found, filled with cryptic entries about the church's final service. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and faded incense, the wooden pews splintered and rotting beneath layers of grime.
Faint traces of music lingered, as if the walls remembered every note sung decades ago. Anna's breath caught as a soft murmur drifted through the shadows, like a choir warming up unseen.
She followed the sound to the altar, where a broken organ stood silent and broken, its keys yellowed and cracked. The whispers rose, swelling into a low chant, a sorrowful melody that seeped into her bones, threading through the silence like cold fingers. Suddenly, the candles along the walls flickered to life, their flames wavering as unseen voices harmonized in a chilling hymn. Figures emerged from the shadows, transparent, wavering forms of the long-forgotten choir, their faces twisted in expressions of anguish and longing.
Anna's heart pounded as the song grew louder, wrapping around her like a suffocating shroud.
She tried to run, but the choir's mournful eyes held her fast, their voices blending into a single, terrible note that echoed through the church's hollow bones. As the last syllable faded, the apparitions vanished, leaving only silence and the haunting knowledge that the forgotten choir would sing forevermore, their voices trapped between the rain and the ruined stones of the church.
Story 20. The Whispering Cellar.
The rain fell steadily, an unending lullaby against the cracked windows of the old farmhouse. Samuel leaned against the creaking doorframe, eyes fixed on the darkened cellar stairs that led down beneath the house.
He had avoided the cellar since he moved in, drawn by a nagging fear that something waited below, a whisper on the wind, a shadow in the corner of his vision.
Tonight, the storm was fierce, and the power flickered, leaving the house in deepening gloom. The candle in his hand trembled, casting wavering light that barely touched the jagged edges of the cellar entrance. A cold draught rose up, carrying with it the faintest murmur of words half heard, like a secret spoken through cracked walls. Samuel's breath hitched as he stepped down, each creaking stair echoing into the damp, musty darkness. The walls seemed to close in, thick with moisture and the scent of forgotten things. The whispers grew louder, soft, urgent, pleading and yet unintelligible, like a language just beyond comprehension. At the cellar's heart, he found the old well, its stones slick with moss and something darker. The whispers swirled around it, voices rising in a chorus of sorrow and warning.
A faint glow passed from the depths, a pale light that beckoned and repelled all at once.
Suddenly, the candle sputtered and died, plunging Samuel into a darkness so complete it was alive.
The whispers became words, clear and cold, telling of forgotten scenes and restless souls bound beneath the house.
Shapes moved just beyond the edge of his sight, cold hands reaching, shadows twisting.
Samuel tried to flee, but the cellar seemed endless. The stairs vanished into blackness.
The last thing he felt was the icy grip of the darkness closing around him, the whispered voices promising he would never leave.
Outside, the rain continued, washing the farmhouse clean, while beneath the earth, the whispers waited for the next listener to descend into the silence.